And welcome everybody. Great to see you all today. Thank you so much for making the time to be with us for this event, the launch of VCOSS's new report on climate change adaptation for all, addressing Victoria's widening inequality with transformative climate adaptation. A really exciting topic and research that we're very proud of. So it's great to have so many people here. I think we've got 50 people on the line and many others who may be joining over the next few minutes. So thank you so much for your attendance today. Before we start, I would, of course, like to acknowledge that we are meeting on Aboriginal land, which is unceded land of the one. I'm on the lands of the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung people here in Melbourne CBD, and I would like to begin by acknowledging their elders and ancestors, and also extending that acknowledgement and respect to the First Peoples of the lands that you are all joining from. I think we've got people from all across the state here today, so welcome, and also a warm welcome and an acknowledgement of any First Nations people joining us on this call today. I'd also like to acknowledge that in this space, recognising and upholding the rights of Aboriginal people and First Nations Victorians must be at the heart of our climate response. This is Aboriginal land, always was, always will be, and it is a changing landscape, and one that Aboriginal people have cared for since time immemorial. So it is a very important central tenet and foregrounded in our research report released today around the rights of First Peoples to be involved in, respected in, and at the centre of our response to climate in it and the changing landscape, land, waters and sky. This new report has explored how Victorians who are experiencing disadvantage and poverty are adapting to climate change and what supports they need to adapt well to as climate change continues. So I believe that a link to the report is now going to be ceremonially dropped into the chat. So you will be able to review that report as we go through today's launch event. And we'll be hearing today from a number of representatives from Victorian Community Services on climate adaptation and hearing about their views on why we need transformative action and some of the work that they are doing in local communities to bring that into a reality. So first we'll be hearing from Trish Quibell, who's the CEO of Primary Care Connect, who will be sharing some of Primary Care Connect's experiences of how people impacted by climate change in the Shepparton region have been working with Primary Care Connect staff to support them to adapt to those climate impacts. After we hear from Trish, then our report author here at VCOSS, Julianne Tice, will be sharing the report's key findings and recommendations. And after that, we'll hear from two community representatives from the sector. Firstly, we have Edgar Cabarello from Banksia Gardens Community Services and also Teresa Carney from Women's Health Goulburn Northeast, who will be sharing case studies of adaptation from their own organisations, and we'll explore what the impacts of these case studies have been and as well as the lessons learned from them for us all. So there'll be a panel discussion featuring Edgar and Teresa, and we will have time for questions from the audience as a part of that panel discussion. So please don't be shy and bring forward your questions when we get into that panel discussion. And finally, for those who choose to stick around, from 11:30 till 12, VCOSS staff will be facilitating discussions in small breakout rooms around adaptation, the themes of our report today, and how the sector can mobilise around adaptation for Victoria's communities. And just to note that we will be recording today's session for distribution, but we'll only be recording the first hour. We will not be recording the breakouts after the launch event. So again, I'm really pleased to see you all here today. Climate adaptation is, of course, a critical and growing issue for Victorians experiencing poverty and disadvantage. And we're seeing the impacts of climate change on people right now, and those impacts are not even. the community services that that are our members and the broader sector is seeing this firsthand every day. We're seeing that people experiencing poverty and disadvantage are feeling the impacts of climate change earlier and in many cases worse than other populations in the community. And we do lack at the moment, unfortunately, a coordinated response to adaptation, which focuses on equity issues and on people experiencing poverty and disadvantage. So that's something that this report kind of digs into and that we will continue to advocate for at VCOSS and in our engagement with the Victorian government. This report also really shines a light on the work that the community sector is doing. It's a huge role to support people to adapt every day. And we know that community organisations play a critical role in supporting communities to adapt, from educating communities about climate change and weather events through to facilitating material needs, providing access to things like food, clothing, and also participating or driving climate adaptation projects like community gardens or hubs. So all of these things, all of these activities are really about adapting to the changes that are being brought about and accelerated by climate change. We need to really shine a light on these activities and the contribution of the community sector to climate adaptation, because we want to make sure that as we pursue the journey towards climate adaptation, that we are linking equity issues to the broader conversation around climate action. We need to understand how people are adapting now and the barriers to their adaptation so that we can make sure that everyone is able to deal with climate impacts into the future and no one is left behind. So as a part of this project, we will be putting together a briefing on adaptation within community services, and that will feature case studies of climate adaptation within the community services sector, like the ones that Teresa and Edgar will share with us today. And that briefing will be shared with you in coming months. But for now, I would very much like to introduce our first speaker, Trish Quibell. Thank you, Trish, for being with us today, all the way from Shep, and over to you now. Thank you.
Thanks, Juanita. Morning, everybody. As Juanita said, my name's Trish Quibell. I'm the CEO of Primary Care Connect, and I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the Yorta Yorta Nations, which is where I'm coming to you from today. Slowly starting to see a little bit of sunshine poking through after some very welcome rain last night as well. So hopefully others in the state have found the same. Can I start by saying I got really excited about this project when Julianne was talking to us about it, and was lucky enough to participate in a couple of conversations as part of Julianne's consultation, both with Shepparton Community Share, which is a group of 4 not-for-profit agencies in the Shepparton area, and we all explicitly cover predominantly the Shepparton, Moira and Strathbogie areas of the state, but then also with my colleagues in community health as part of the Alliance of Rural and Regional Community Health. So we are the 11 rural and regional community health services, independent community health services that cover most of rural and regional Victoria. And I think my first thought when I started looking into this post Julianne's conversation was very much around, we get caught up in the reactive space, and often that stops us or hinders our thinking about climate adaptability right from the very start, because for us climate adaptability sits very much in that upstream preventative space, but we're now in that situation where we seem to be rolling from one natural disaster to another. You've only got to look at what's happening in the up along the north coast, central north coast at the moment, with the cyclone area is up there with the, we don't seem to think about the cyclone within a cold time of the year, but all of the degradation along the coastal areas, but also we've moved from flood a couple of years ago up here in my area, where we've still got a huge number of community members who are still trying to rebuild post flood, but now our farming families are dealing with the issues of drought. So it is that roll-on effect from one to the other, which then creates that significant climate fatigue, I think, and we get stuck in surviving rather than thriving and finding how we can adapt to the climate change changes. In talking to Julianne, I'm just going to talk to a couple of the different experiences that we have in community health that have highlighted some of those community groups where there is a degree of inequity in their ability to adapt to climate. And I'm sure that Edgar and Teresa have got some great examples and far more examples than I've got in terms of that transformative change and where we can head to. So I think for me, I was going to talk today about more where we see the ripple effect. So I think quite often when clients start to access our services, they come in via one of our response programs, and it's almost like you've thrown a stone into the middle of a pond and there's these ripple effects, and it's not till we get to the outer ripples of that we start to think about climate change, because we're engulfed in the midst of service provision in the first part. So I think an example from our community health space is there are 4 of the community health services at the moment that are trialling a community paramedic program, and what we're finding in that community paramedic program, which reaches into vulnerable communities where they are. So we're often tag teaming with neighbourhood houses to deliver chronic condition health check programs with their existing community lunches, which are obviously also dealing with, the cost of living and supporting people who have food insecurity as well, is that what we're seeing is a population within our broader population who have the multiple and compounding issues around climate adaptability, in that they're low to middle income earners. If they have huge job insecurity as well. They often have housing insecurity, and I mentioned flood before, and we've got a number of families that are still living in temporary accommodation and in caravans where they haven't been able to get insurance from the last floods, or can no longer afford the insurance that will give them some level of resilience for the next flood or fire that comes through. But in addition to the cost of living pressures, they have chronic health conditions, and those chronic health conditions are being exacerbated not only by the cost of living and their necessity to, in some cases, ration their medication, which then has obviously another additional impact on their health, but they're often socially isolated, and we don't find out until they come to a community event such as a neighbourhood house lunch that they're sitting at home, they're rationing their heating, and particularly we've had some very cold mornings up here recently, and in the summer they've been rationing their heating, so they're cooling, sorry. So there's these compounding effects on them that have long-term implications on their ability to simply survive, as I said before, rather than thriving. And for them, the ability to think of climate adaptability is so severely hindered by their ability to survive on a day-to-day basis that we as service providers need to start thinking about that climate adaptability on their behalf, as does government, obviously. The broader context of some of those outcomes for an individual are that they also then contribute often to increased numbers of avoidable presentations at hospitals, because they've done things like they've been rationing their medication, which means they're higher risk for adverse outcomes. Increase in GP visits if they can afford to go to them, because for Shepparton, I believe we've got one bulk billing clinic left in town, and it decreases their capacity to engage with broader community conversations and opportunities around climate resilience and climate adaptability. We also, as service providers, and I think everyone on the call would probably agree, we're funded to do reactive and response work. We're not funded necessarily to do preventative work. And I think when the Alliance of Rural and Regional Community Health is talking about our community paramedic program, it very much is sitting in that preventative space. But we're funding it. Those of us that are funding it at the moment are funding it through a variety of mechanisms, often with reserve funds and whatnot, whilst we continue to try to get some more long-term funding for it. But we can see that is where the pressures exist and where we need to be sitting in that preventative space so that we can support community with some more proactive and upstream investment. For me, another option, or another area that comes into mind, particularly in our rural areas, is that inequity of the ability of some of our migrant communities and our farming communities. And in the Shepparton area, they often go hand in hand, where we have significant multicultural community into the communities moving into Shepparton. So we have currently, I think, about 42 different language groups in the service area of Shepparton. So obviously we don't have the ability to employ staff to cover each of those community groups individually, and the community groups themselves often have great social connectedness within their community, but then a reluctance to reach out to the broader mainstream service sector. We don't have an ability to fund every community to have a service sector of their own. So the challenge for us is, how do we bring those community members into our broader mainstream services? Not only for the community themselves as community members, but also we're recognising that for our employees, we have a number of multicultural community members within our employee group who are living in a different standard, I think, than some of our other employees, where they still have community members overseas. So they're sending money overseas to support their community overseas at home, but they're also then being impacted not just by cost of living and climate adaptability here, but they're being impacted emotionally and psychologically through the geopolitical environment and, you know, droughts, whether that be drought in Africa or the most recent Iraq and Israeli war, where a number of our Iranian community members are suffering significant emotional trauma as a result of that. So again, the concept of adaptability is secondary to simply survival. In our community, we've had, with our agricultural history up here as one of the food bowls of Australia, the climate is wreaking havoc at the moment in relation to droughts and floods. And we had a huge number of community members during the last flood, where we have a significant palm worker scheme. Those palm workers have come over here on sponsored visas specifically to work on farms, but when you've got that job insecurity of a flood will wipe out a crop within the fruit industry, the security of your job is no longer there. They're living in crowded conditions, and as soon as there is no work, if they stay here, then they're not here legally. So they then lose access to essential services as well, which then compounds their ability to adapt to the climate and to the environment around them. So and even our traditional farming families, we're finding that with the drought, we're very concerned about farmer health, because our farmers by tradition will often prioritise the health of their livestock and their farms rather than themselves. So they will start to, well, in that event of trying to survive and trying to maintain a living and trying to maintain their animals' health and their crop health, they're actually avoiding their own health. And we often find that those farmers are again having long-term farming health outcomes, and we lack the ability often to reach into those communities, because they do tend to come together and shut down a lot because of the essential nature of the work that they do and the critical events of just simply trying to survive another drought. So I think that capacity for upstream investment, we're talking about it obviously in the context of a VCOSS report, and you know, I'd like to thank Julianne and Juanita and VCOSS for putting together the report and the time into establishing that consultation, which I think has been really great. But it's not just VCOSS and, you know, our community services or our health departments that need to think about this. We need to have that collaboration of whole of government in order to support any adaptability strategies, because for us up here in the country, we can't do it without Department of Agriculture, but we also can't do it without things like the Federal Department of Home Affairs in terms of our migrant communities. So I think, you know, it's essential that we need to be able to get greater collaboration between the multiple layers of government and the varied departments within those levels of government in order to think in a preventative space around climate adaptability, or we're simply going to continue to go down. We're going to get caught up in the increasing need for service provision in that responsive framework, rather than thinking about how do we look upstream to develop some level of resilience to the changing climate that we're all exposed to, regardless of where we live. So Julianne, I hope that met your needs this morning. I feel like I've given the doomsday approach, unfortunately, but I think, you know, there are some great opportunities out there. But for me, my participation in this was very much around opening my eyes even more to what are those issues and how that ripple effect is impacting our communities, and we need to make climate adaptability and resilience one of the inner ripples rather than leaving it till we get to the outer edges of the pool to start thinking about it. So thank you. I think I've probably gone over time. I apologise, Julianne, but I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much, Trish. That was really enlightening and also such a great example, such great examples of how you know, climate adaptation and disaster resilience are integrated across so many other areas of need. And yeah, thank you so much. Especially appreciated your comments about farming communities and the importance of them and the challenges as well to accessing those communities in terms of health and climate impacts. I'll hand over now to Julianne, who's going to take us through an overview of our report findings. Thank you, Julianne.
Great. Thanks so much, Juanita. And thank you, Trish. That was a fantastic overview of some of the problems that are being faced by a lot of people in Victoria. So really appreciate you giving all of those examples. So now I will go into the findings of the report. If you just give me 1 second while I set up my screen. Here we go. So yes, thank you again, everyone, for coming along to our launch. It's really great to have you all here. And thank you to Juanita for opening and Trish for those really wonderful remarks. It's really scene setting for what I'm going to be talking about next in terms of what were our findings and what we're recommending to be done about all of this. So that's our wonderful report cover. And then before I go into talking about the project and our findings and recommendations, I'll also acknowledge that I'm dialing in from Wurundjeri lands here in Naarm, Melbourne. And I would like to acknowledge that we're all dialing in from stolen lands and that sovereignty has never been ceded. So I'll just talk a little bit about the background around the project before going into the findings and recommendations. So as Juanita was alluding to in the beginning, in the introduction, the reason we wanted to undertake this project around looking into how people are adapting to climate change, how people experiencing poverty and disadvantage are doing that, is because there's a lot of focus in Victoria on climate response, and a lot of that is around climate mitigation. And as you'll see in our recommendations, our first headline recommendation is to continue that focus, because that really is the most important, most urgent thing to make sure that we're reducing our contribution to climate change as much as possible now, so that we have fewer climate impacts to deal with in the future. And that's in Victoria and around the world. But while we're doing that really important work on climate mitigation, we also need to be doing the work on adaptation and making sure we're bringing along everyone in Victoria on that adaptation journey, because we are already experiencing the impacts of climate change now, and they're only going to grow over the long term, even though we are taking a lot of action to address them now. No matter how much action we take now, there will still be some degree of climate impacts into the future. So we were really wanting to look into this, this adaptation question for people in Victoria who are experiencing poverty and disadvantage, because we wanted to kind of make that link between adaptation and equity, but we also wanted to draw attention to the fact that if we're not supporting those who have the fewest resources to adapt on their own, those are the people that are going to be falling through the cracks as climate change progresses. And if we're not supporting them, we're just going to, as the report suggests, face increasingly wide inequality between the people who can afford to support their own adaptation and between those people who don't have those resources. So the project looked into 3 main research questions, which we have on the screen here. First, what capacity do Victorians who are experiencing poverty and social disadvantage have to adapt themselves to climate change? How are people actually beginning to adapt? And how can people be supported to adapt well in the coming decades? And This is a list of everyone we spoke to. So what we did first was a bit of a desktop literature review on adaptation and equitable responses. And then we did 25 interviews and focus groups with Victorian community service organizations and academics, all listed here. And we also engaged directly with 13 people with lived and living experience of poverty and disadvantage, which we have listed on the right-hand side of the screen. And this report also drew from a lot of other community engagement sessions that VCOSS has done under other projects under the climate equity banner, but all of those kind of tell the same story around how people are responding to climate change. And our audience for this report primarily is the Victorian government to make the case for action on equitable adaptation, but secondarily the community services sector to be used as a tool for advocacy, to have something to point to say, these are the problems people are facing and this is why we need to take action in this space. And so I'll go into the key findings now. It's a lot of what Trish has spoken to, so really appreciate that comprehensive overview. But our first key finding, and I've got some quotes from the research here, those will all be in the report, so I won't speak to them. But first key finding is that experiences of poverty and disadvantage limit individual adaptive capacity. This won't be a surprising finding, but it really is just making that link between how people are adapting and the other, all of the social drivers, all of the drivers of social disadvantage. And so as we've said, and as Juanita and Trish have said, not only are people on low incomes impacted first and worst by climate change, but their ability to adapt to these experiences is also constrained by the same forces that make them exposed to those impacts first and worse. So we looked at a few examples in the report, by no means a comprehensive list of how people are impacted, but we did look at location, impacts of colonization, ongoing impacts of colonization, disability, gender structures, age, and housing quality, and how all of these factors individually limit people's adaptive capacity, but also people are never really experiencing just one of those limiting factors. So we also looked at how those each of those factors intersect to further limit people's capacity to adapt. And I won't speak too much in depth into this image, but this is an example that we give in the report, and it draws from previous VCOSS research, and it looks at locational disadvantage and how that limits adaptive capacity. So we've got two maps of Greater Melbourne here. On the left, we have a map of Greater Melbourne local government areas in varying shades of blue, and darker shades of blue correspond with higher rates of poverty in that area. So we've got areas like Greater Dandenong, Casey, Hume, and Brimbank in those kind of darker colors. And then on the right, we have varying shades of red, orange, and yellow corresponding with the urban heat island effect. And so darker colors meaning higher heat. Melton, Brimbank, Casey, Greater Dandenong, Hume, all having those darker colors. So these two maps show that roughly there's a correlation between if you're living in an area with a higher rate of poverty, you're also more likely to be living in a hotter area. And I'll also just state that this report really did look at those long-term impacts of climate change, both in terms of direct impacts like heat, really being the big one, but also storms and things like that, drought, but didn't look at disaster specifically. And in part, that's because VCOSS has a whole separate stream of work on disaster resilience, but also we wanted to draw out those experience of people on the day-to-day and over the long term in terms of climate change. So our second key finding is that the rising cost of living constrains capacity to adapt, and that's of course wrapped into limitations or the structural drivers of poverty. So the cost of living is the #1 issue people raise when we speak to them about climate change, and that was for this project, but for also all of the other community consultation we do around climate equity. It's always raised in terms of how people are being squeezed from all different angles in terms of costs. And it really is the case that many of the issues people who are on low incomes face boil down to is just the cost of everything in life and how that's all increasing. And this is really significant because climate change, as climate change is progressing, it is driving costs of basically everything in life, in part because it's driving costs for fuel, food, and insurance prices, and that boils down to almost every aspect of life. And that squeezes people with the least resources and really leaves little capacity to be able to adapt in a meaningful way. Third key finding is that climate change is fueling a feedback loop that erodes disadvantaged Victorians' capacity to adapt. And Trish spoke to this really well in all of the examples she gave, where people are becoming more socially isolated, rationing medications, things like that. And then that's further reducing their capacity to adapt. That's basically it in a nutshell. So we found that some people are adopting coping strategies that aren't really quite adapting, because these strategies they're adopting do have long-term impacts to health and well-being. And so an example we give in the report is that some people are staying home possibly for days on end, possibly completely alone during heat waves, just to avoid going out in the heat. Some people have nowhere else to go at all and to keep cool. And this can lead to increased social isolation, people not attending physical and mental health appointments, a whole range of different flow-on impacts that can then further reduce their capacity to adapt, because things like health and finances are impact that then limit their adaptive capacity. And this is highly inequitable, because the people who are already being impacted first and worst are then facing constraints on their capacity to adapt, meaning they're ultimately experiencing continually worse outcomes over time. And final key finding is that placing responsibility for adaptation on individuals exacerbates inequities and leads to a widening gap between those who have the resources to support their own adaptation and those who are not. But the corollary to this is that we found that people who are able to link in with their communities or with their local community service organization are faring much better, because they have that support they need to be able to adapt in a more healthy and ongoing way that has better impacts for their health and well-being. And so what do we do about all of this? Overarching recommendation is that Victoria must prioritize transformative adaptation, and transformative adaptation refers to adaptation that alters the structures that place individuals in poverty, rather than band-aid short-term adaptation solutions. And part of this is removing the burden for adaptation on individuals by instead taking action at the community level and at all levels of government. As Trish said, not just the Victorian government, obviously that's where our report is focused, but at all levels of government, we need to be coordinating with the federal government, state governments, and local governments. An example of this would be investing in adaptation targeted directly at people and communities living in poverty and experiencing disadvantage, and enabling those communities to lead their own adaptation strategies to be able to speak for what they need. And a lot of that will probably be accessing those basic needs like stable housing that protects them from the elements, fresh, healthy food, stable employment, things like that. Other examples are funding the equity-specific actions within Victoria's adaptation action plans. So Victoria does have really great frameworks for adaptation. We just need more of the funding in place to implement some of those actions that are directly targeted towards people experiencing poverty and disadvantage. And we list all of those actions at the end of the report. And I'll finally just really quickly speak to our recommendations. These are our 4 headline recommendations, and each of those has sub-recommendations within them. Number 1, again, continue to urgently invest in climate mitigation to reduce the impacts of climate change that we will feel into the future and the impacts that we will need to adapt to. Number 2 is to strengthen investment in adaptation targeted at Victorians who are experiencing the most significant climate impacts because they are experiencing poverty and disadvantage. Number 3 is to increase funding for community service organizations and Aboriginal community-controlled organizations, the ones that are already supporting people on a day-to-day basis with getting the basic needs and adapting the best they can. And 4th is to strengthen accountability across the whole of government. And again, we're focusing here on the Victorian government, but we do say we need action at all levels of government on climate change and intergenerational equity to ensure we have the most positive outcomes into the future. And I will end there. Thank you so much, everyone, and thank you for being here. I will stop sharing my screen.
Thank you, Julianne. Fantastic. So next we're going to move on to the panel discussion. And in this section of the session, we'll be able to hear, as I mentioned earlier, from two representatives of community organisations that have really interesting case studies that augment and make real some of the issues that Julianne has outlined in terms of the overview of the report and its findings. So let's hear how community services are responding to these challenges. First, we'll be hearing from Edgar Cabarello, who is the Sustainability and Education Coordinator at Banksia Gardens Community Services. Welcome, Edgar. Banksia Gardens, for those who don't know, is located in Broadmeadows and is a neighbourhood house, a learn local, and an organisation with a strong commitment to community development and action research. So Banksia Gardens programs mainly focus on early childhood education and training, gender equity, young people, environmental sustainability, and community participation and advocacy. And next, after we've heard from Edgar, we'll be hearing from Teresa Carney, who is the Regional Manager of Strategy, Partnerships and Programs at Women's Health Goulburn Northeast, which is welcome, Teresa. Women's Health Goulburn Northeast is a feminist organisation that leads change towards women's empowerment, women's health, the prevention of violence against women, and ultimately gender equality in regional and rural Victoria. So first of all, I'd just like to ask each of you, Edgar and Teresa, to tell us a little bit about your approach to adaptation or about the project that you have featured in our case study research. Edgar, firstly, perhaps to you. Welcome.
Sure, thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation and the recognitions for the efforts that we've been doing. And look, I would say, in order to speak to the approach, which I can quickly say it's a holistic approach, a place-based adaptation approach, but it's to understand that also adaptation, and I was looking at the United Nations climate change elements, they say it needs to be, climate change adaptation needs to be social, economical, and in biodiversity or in the natural states, no, in all these systems, the ecological systems. So I guess when I say place-based adaptations, is like we have, for the amount of time that we've been working in this community in Broadmeadows, in particularly located right next to one of the most disadvantaged public housing estates, is that we've been observing what has been happening in all these systems that I'm talking about. In disadvantage, all that has been said, it's shown here, like low household income, high unemployment rates, low educational attainments, high number of households where no English is used, high level of single parents in the households, high housing stress, you know, where the people either renting or paying mortgage are paying more than 30% of their income. And also we've understand that our biodiversity is low. It's heavily fragmented. It was once dominated by beautiful grasslands. Now it's mostly like weeds that have dominated, litter dumping, erosions. So with these observations, that, you know, they bring into the heat island effect, the soil compactation, the urban runoff. So we approach with this holistic approach, the ecological, where we've been working in 6 gardens, particularly with the focus for climate adaptation. They all have like different names and purposes, but it's basically we are starting from the soil, which is we've been composting a lot of organic matter to recover the soil because it's very heavily compacted and rich in clay. Our idea is that if we're able to increase our biodiversity, focusing on canopy, then we will reduce the impact of the heat, at least in the area that we can move freely, which is the space, our headquarters that we are. In the social element, we do a lot of education. We have I would say, a signature program. It's called CARIA, Climate Adaptation Requires Youth Action. where it's a group of young people. We gather and then we give a little bit of training, 8 weeks of training on all the elements that we consider relevant, which includes gender equality, indigenous knowledge, mental health, and all the other topics that I've just said. And we listen to what the ideas can come from young people, and then we support those ideas to turn into action. Now we're delivering this career program in collaboration with Kangan Institute, which is very important. Another part of the holistic is just creating networks and strengthening through collaboration with other organizations. We're doing it as a breakfast club for year 10s, year 11s, which has been fantastic. And in the and we have other programs in education, but just to finish with the economic element, we have this program named we focus in circular economy. We understand, for instance, that when we compost, because we've been composting, over 5.5 tons in the past 2 years by hand, creating good soil for our community gardens, for our native gardens, that our community gardens are also growing food that will go to our social enterprises. We have 2 different cafes, a bicycle workshop, a maker space called Nori Brody, that all these spaces give opportunities for young people. And we've actually got the fund to pay for these young people to get apprenticeships apprenticeship for young people who have been disengaged in education and disengaged from the workforce for a long time. And so that gives them some training for a little bit, and it's paid training and support with mentorship, with learning, and then focusing on getting a future job after this like this experience of learning how to work. So it goes from the basics, and we understand all interconnected. I'm going to stop there now, but thank you. Yes, Teresa.
Thanks, Teresa. Teresa, please feel free. Thank you, Edgar. That's really interesting. And just as well, just to note for everyone on the call, and we do have that the link available, I believe, to the report. But there are a number, I believe, of different case studies or projects that are, embedded in Banksia Gardens that, as you say, have that kind of holistic climate focus as well. So yeah, thank you for outlining some of those programs and initiatives. Teresa, what's your approach? What are the projects that you've been doing up there in Goulburn Northeast?
Thanks, Juanita. And thanks, Edgar. That sounds amazing. I'm coming to visit.
Please do.
I'm going to go a little bit off. I'm going to do a Donald. I'm going to go off script. But just to say, because Tricia outlined a lot of the things in the farming community where our case study was, so I thought I'd just broaden it a bit. And I'm noting in listening to you, Edgar, that where I'm about to talk about was in response, but what came out of our response and the funding was actually going into prevention as well. So to stop me talking in riddles, when we received our funding, we thought that what we would do is, first of all, go and have a look and see, what we're understanding the immediate mental health and well-being needs in the area. And we're in the Goulburn Northeast in 12 LGAs. And then we wanted to increase integration of existing programs to consider and then embed a gendered approach to mental health and well-being, making sure we were kind of figuring out who was coordinating, what was being coordinated, how could we add value rather than go off and do something on our own. So linking into that whole big response in our area. And then we also wanted to increase the availability and access to some tailored resources and activities, and around building capacity of stakeholders to address women's mental health and well-being post the disaster. So just what that looked like then. So we had a chat to around 30 stakeholders. We saw that there were about 17 we could possibly work with and piggyback on things. And as Tricia was saying, in that Shepperton area, we worked in the multicultural space. We did specific disaster preparedness in first language for some of the groups. And then we did specific mental health and well-being as well in first language for mainly Afghani women, and around that stigma and being able to speak about how they were being impacted. And also for women, we did connection activities for women and children. So that meant we facilitated 13 events. We did 6 small grants as well, where women identified what it is they would like to do. So we gave them the grant to go and do whatever they wanted to do with that. And then we also did some research for care through disaster with Australia Remade. And this is this space I think that's really interesting when we look about the adaptation and what community is saying they need and they want and what it looks like. So, and we've continued on with that. It's for us, it's very exciting. And then we also had a little disaster response trauma kits, which were made by Tots to Teens, and they were a small pack of toys and things. But the objective is that they got handed out at either with emergency services, and they went into kindies and primary and secondary schools with the idea is that while they were distributed, it was an opportunity to discuss about disaster and, you know, how people and the children were feeling. So in particular, the events, they really provided the opportunity for women to connect at their self-identified activities. So,
Fantastic. Thank you, Teresa. Sounds really, really interesting. And you've both mentioned, Edgar and Teresa, particular cohorts that you've been working with through your projects. Edgar, you mentioned young people and people particularly who are disengaged with the mainstream education system, offering opportunities for them. And obviously, Teresa, you're working with women and also with children in regional areas. Can you tell us about some of the challenges that these particular cohorts that you've been working with are facing relating to climate change? Edgar, do you want to go first?
Well, yes, I'm happy to talk. I don't know. I could tell you, yes, of course, the challenges are some sort of like food security. Before one of our focus is also on growing food. But I was also thinking on a particular case on a resident, maybe giving an example helps. She was a refugee woman who waited for 5 years to locate her family overseas. And then once she was able to locate her daughters and mother, she took 5 more years to get them into Australia. Only having 2 more children here in school and living in the public housing just next to where Banksia Gardens is. And once the other girls and all of them are girls, all of the children and mom were able to come to Australia, you know, they were a lot of people living in that house. It was a little bit overcrowded. She was very engaged with our community program. She was very engaged with the program where we actually set up garden beds in the people's houses so they could grow things, and we would help, you know, nourishing that soil and, you know, supporting. And she knew much more than I know about plants and how to grow them. You know, she was fantastic. But the social environment was very oppressive, and particularly with the gender lens, and very male dominated. She felt so insecure that, you know, one day told me it was worse than the refugee camp, and felt insecure, and she actually left without much noticing, because she wasn't able to organize a transfer to another housing, even if she requested this. And so and for me, that was the end of the story, because I haven't heard from her since. No, I did hear that she's well now. She found a new home, and in a much better condition and situation. But it is just to highlight that without the basic needs cover, which is that basic security, and not feeling unsafe walking. The girls were feeling unsafe just walking in the street, so they would never leave the house. It is really hard to focus, even if she wanted, like with the composting, with the everything that I was proposing to her, she was like always smiling and trying to participate. But it came to a situation where it was, no more possible. I am hoping that now she would be able to engage, and it was probably a case just to highlight, we need to observe the whole environment, I guess.
That's right. Thank you, Edgar, for that example. And I think it does demonstrate as well that, a little bit of what Trish was saying as well at the start, that when you are, in that crisis moment, when you don't have your basic needs met, it is incredibly, and this is what the report, right, says as well, is that it is very difficult to do those additional, activities that help you live, healthily and well, if some of those fundamental needs are not being met. So thank you for that example. Teresa, how about you? Perhaps you could talk about some of the challenges and also some of the impacts that your work has been having on those women and children.
Yeah, thanks, Anita. Thanks, Edgar. I pick up again on what Tricia was saying before, and just to say that we also, apart from the multicultural women from multicultural backgrounds, we also had women from small rural areas, like really small towns and that. And for example, Barma and Euroa and Talangata, and especially women on farms. So, and could I say we really saw the intersections of poverty and gender and disaster come through when we did this project work. And we heard from the women on farms about that unpredictability about the weather events, like Tricia mentioned, from year to year, so they just finished getting over, not even finished, but, were, for want of a better term, getting over fires, and not long before floods came. And, it takes up to 10 years for full recovery, and having them so close is a great source of anxiety and stress. So it caused them additional work with cleaning up, with fences and restoring things back to where they were before, as well as having to carry that emotional load and carry on, get the household back in order, run a family and things. And then sometimes having to think about possibly a job, because now crops are gone or their income is gone for a while. And then the perils of distance. So you can't just pop around the corner for a cuppa if you're feeling low. And then, Juanita, you asked me about the impact, yeah?
Yes.
Yeah. So to take away from all the heavy stuff, I would just say that the women really value the opportunity to connect socially and psychologically, and they really felt heard and valued, and of course the opportunity for some fun as well, because it's really heavy and if it's continuous. So the opportunity to have the education around the disaster preparedness in first language too, and the chance to know who to connect with at times, because even in that settlement space, you might give that information, but you have new people coming all the time. And so they really need to know who in the community in this time of need can they go to. And that was, they felt really valued. The other one, I mentioned it before, was when we did talk to focus groups around the care through disaster framework and understanding what that looked like. The people, we say the marginalized and can't often get to have their voices heard, they really enjoy the opportunity to be heard and be consulted. And and then women with young families, they really value that opportunity to go have activities, because as we mentioned before, that cost, with the cost of living, there's just, everything is so tight. And they said that gave them the opportunity to feel normal after the floods, and to feel just, getting back to feel like without that stress, and do fun things together as a family.
Fantastic. That's gorgeous. Thank you, Teresa. And, very much highlights, well, we did a piece of work, Julianne actually did a piece of work last year where we did some climate related conversations with people in communities across the state, and what came through really clearly in that report was the importance of hope and the importance of some light and some fun in these really tricky and very, existentially challenging conversations and policy spaces. So thank you for reflecting on the fun and the light and connection that your work has brought to women in Goulburn. Does anyone have any questions? Oh, we've got some coming through. We've got one question coming through from Carolyn. Thank you, Carolyn. And Carolyn says, I think the transformative adaptation systems need to address the systemic and financial disadvantage that's referred to, and also the inequity in access to the adaptation systems. How do we do this? Would either of you, Edgar or Teresa, like to respond to Carolyn's question, which is essentially around how do we address systemic and financial disadvantage in terms of the way that we're thinking about adaptation? Any ideas?
Well, look, yes, I have an idea, which is that program that I was talking about, that we pay some young people. We believe that this is a really good program addressing all this. First of all, the businesses that we developed, they're social businesses. We have better benefit outputs rather than income. In fact, some of the businesses, the social enterprises that we run, need input, financial input, rather than what they give to the organization to continue running it. But the really good outcome, it's the opportunities that gives to these young people that we were talking about. Our first iteration was like 20 young people. It's not much. It really is not much. So a good way, I feel that a good way is like, if investment, which is one of the recommendations of the report, if investment from the Victorian government is given to organizations that can have ideas to activate, to have social enterprises that can hire young people, not to give them, the eternal job and that's it, they can sit cross hands. It's to train them, like really teach them how to work, because they're basic elements that they don't know how to work, how to arrive on time, how to call if they feel sick, like little things. And so giving those opportunities, I believe it's quite significant. I think half of the cohort that we gave, they've already gained another job after, because that program finished. At least half of the cohort already gained a new job. So,
and a job that is, has that mindfulness around climate and around kind of holistic solutions to big problems. We've got an excellent array of questions that have come through very late in the piece, and unfortunately we have run out of time for this panel session. So thank you to those who did offer questions, and perhaps if you're staying online, those questions might be actually really useful launching points for the breakout sessions, which are coming now. So for those who are leaving us at 11:30, I do want to thank you both, Teresa and Edgar, for your contributions today. Thank you so much, and for the work that you're doing in your communities. And also, of course, to Trish Quibell from Primary Care Connect, who spoke at the top of this session today. Thank you all for sharing your time and insights with us. Thanks to Julianne and the VCOSS team for organising this event today, and congratulations to the authors on the launch. And for those of you who are staying online, we'll now allocate participants to a breakout room. Some of those questions that you see on the chat there, as I say, might be great places to start the conversation. And for those who are joining us now, I do wish you a very beautiful day, and we'll see you again next time. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Teresa and Juanita.